Monday morning. 8:47 a.m. Min's silver SUV sat motionless in the middle lane of Truong Chin Street, surrounded by a symphony of horns that blared like the end of the world. Cars swerved around him. A motorbike driver shouted something about his mother. Someone else flipped him off. Min didn't notice any of it. His hands rested on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they'd been for the past 4 minutes, and his eyes tracked a single yellow leaf that had landed on his windshield and was now being dragged slowly upward by the wind, pressed flat against the glass like a tiny golden hand trying to get his attention. The leaf was stubborn. It should have blown away immediately. The wind was strong that morning, whipping through the city ahead of a coming storm, but it clung there, trembling, refusing to let go. Min watched it with the kind of hollow fascination that comes when you've been running on empty for so long you've forgotten what full feels like. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. His boss, probably. The 9 a.m. meeting. The client presentation he'd spent the last 2 weeks preparing, the one that was supposed to salvage the quarter. The phone buzzed again. Then again. Min reached over slowly, almost underwater, and turned it face down. Here's the thing about Min that nobody at his firm knew: he hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night for the past 18 days. Not because of insomnia in the clinical sense, but because every time he closed his eyes, he saw blueprints. The community center project, his project, the one he'd sketched on a napkin 3 years ago during a prayer retreat in Dilat, the one he genuinely believed God had downloaded directly into his imagination, it was dead. Officially dead as of last Thursday. The investors had pulled out via a 2-line email that didn't even have the decency to include a comma between regret and unfortunately. The bank had followed up the next morning with a form letter that used the phrase current economic climate 3 times. And then, on Friday night, sitting across from him at the dinner table while the kids were watching cartoons in the other room, his wife had set down her chopsticks and said the 6 words that had been echoing in his skull ever since. Maybe God doesn't want you to do this. She hadn't meant it as a weapon. Lon wasn't cruel, she was practical, exhausted, watching her husband drown in a dream that had produced nothing but debt and disappointment for 3 straight years. She'd said it gently, the way you tell someone that the restaurant they loved has closed down. But to Min, it landed like a verdict. Because if Lon was right, if God wasn't in this, then what had he been doing? What had the last 3 years been? A delusion? An ego trip dressed up in spiritual language? A monument to his own stubbornness that he'd baptized with prayer language to make it feel holy? Min watched it go, and something in his chest cracked open just a little wider. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter, not dramatic, not stormy, just uniformly gray in that oppressive way that makes 9 a.m. feel like 5 p.m. The kind of sky that doesn't threaten rain so much as it threatens nothing at all, just an endless flat expanse of indifference. The traffic around him had adjusted to his stationary vehicle the way traffic does. People found their way around, cursed him out, moved on with their lives. A traffic officer would probably show up eventually. Min didn't care. He was 42 years old, a licensed architect with a master's degree and a mortgage and 2 daughters who still thought he was a hero, and he was sitting in his car on a Monday morning crying over a leaf. No, not over a leaf. Over a memory. One that had just surfaced without warning, the way memories do when you're too exhausted to keep the lid on. 20 years ago. The university library. 3rd floor, the quiet section where nobody went because the air conditioning was broken and it smelled like old paper and mildew. Min was 22, a scholarship student from the provinces, living on instant noodles and the stubborn belief that architecture could be a form of worship. He was hunched over a stack of scrap paper, the backsides of old printouts he'd salvaged from the computer lab recycling bin, sketching the same building over and over. A church. Not a real church, just one he'd imagined, with a roof that curved like a wave and walls that seemed to breathe. He'd been working on it for weeks, hiding it from his classmates because it felt too personal, too raw, like showing someone your prayers. He hadn't heard the footsteps. Professor Tuan was ancient even then, a man in his 70s who still wore the same brown sweater every day and spoke in a voice so soft you had to lean in to hear him. He'd stopped behind Min's chair and stood there for what felt like an eternity, saying nothing. Min had frozen, his pencil hovering above the paper, certain he was about to be told to stop wasting time on fantasies and focus on his coursework. Instead, the professor had placed one wrinkled hand on Min's shoulder and said, quietly, "You have a gift from God, young man. Don't ever bury it." That was it. No grand speech. No mentorship offer. He just said those 12 words and walked away, leaving Min blinking back tears in the stuffy silence of the library. And here's the strange part, Min hadn't thought about that moment in years. Maybe a decade. He'd gotten busy, gotten successful, gotten comfortable. The professor had died 6 years ago. The memory had been filed away somewhere in the back of his mind, gathering dust like an old sketchbook in a storage box. But now, sitting in his car on Truong Chin Street with the gray sky pressing down and his dead project in the trunk of his heart, Min could hear those words as clearly as if the old man were sitting in the passenger seat. You have a gift from God. Don't ever bury it. The tears came before Min could stop them. He'd been sitting in the middle of Truong Chin Street for, he checked the dashboard clock, 11 minutes. His hand moved before his brain gave the command. He put the car in drive. Not toward the office. Not toward the glass tower on Nguyen Hue Boulevard where his firm occupied the 17th floor and his partners had stopped asking about the church project 6 months ago. He turned left onto a side street, then right, then left again, navigating a maze of alleyways he hadn't traveled in 2 decades, following a route that existed only in the body's memory, the way your feet remember the path to your childhood home even when your mind has filed it away. The church was still there. Our Lady of Perpetual Help. 130 years old, built by French missionaries in a style that had never quite decided if it was Gothic or something humbler, something that had learned to bend its head beneath the weight of the tropical sun. Min parked across the street and sat there, engine off, staring at the heavy wooden doors. He hadn't been here since he was 22. The last time, he'd been a scholarship student with calloused fingers and a desperate prayer, waiting for news about a grant that would either save him or send him back to the provinces. He'd sat in the back pew, the same one he was walking toward now, and he'd cried when the email came through on his ancient Nokia brick phone. The doors groaned when he pushed them. Inside, the air was cool and still, thick with the smell of old incense and candle wax and something else, something Min could only describe as patience. He walked past the holy water font without dipping his fingers. Old habits had faded. He walked past the statue of Mary, her plaster hands outstretched, her plaster face frozen in an expression of eternal compassion. He walked past the confessionals with their dark wooden doors and their little green lights, and he wondered briefly if priests still sat in there, still listened to sins, still offered absolution in the name of a God who had already forgiven everything 2,000 years ago. The back pew. Third from the rear, left side. The wood was worn smooth in the center where 2 decades of bodies had sat and stood and knelt and wept. Min lowered himself onto the hard surface and stared at the altar. The crucifix hung above it, Christ's body twisted in that familiar agony, and the stained glass behind him filtered the weak morning light into fragments of red and blue and gold. 20 years ago, he'd been a boy with a dream and an empty stomach and a professor who had seen something in him. Now he was a man with a mortgage and a failing project and a wife who looked at him with something worse than anger, pity. The kind of pity that says I love you but I don't know how to help you anymore. Min closed his eyes. And then, because he didn't know what else to do, because the prayers of his childhood had left their grooves in his soul like wagon tracks in old stone, he started talking. I don't know if you're listening. His voice echoed slightly in the empty church. It sounded small. It sounded like a man who had been shouting into the void for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be heard. I don't know if I even believe you're listening. But I'm here. And I don't know where else to go. His words came slowly at first, halting and dry, scraping past a throat tight from years of swallowed disappointment. Then they began to rush, tumbling out in broken shards, like water finally breaching a fractured dam. He pressed his palms together until the knuckles ached, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. I gave everything to this project, Lord. 3 years. The curved roofline that was supposed to lift people's eyes toward heaven. The walls designed to breathe, so even the stones could sing. The light, oh, that light was meant to fall on the altar just so, catching the edge of the cross until even a skeptic might catch his breath and wonder if something sacred still lingered in this broken world. A tear slid down his cheek, unbidden, and he let it fall unashamed. But the investors, God. The investors said the vision was too costly, too impractical. They pulled out last night, every last one of them. I'm left with nothing but blueprints and a hollow chest. Tell me, was this dream ever yours, or just my own stubborn pride trying to build a monument to my name? His fingers unclenched slowly, his heart laid bare between the pews. Who had smiled and nodded and then vanished. About the contractors who had quoted prices that made his stomach drop. About the partners at his firm who had stopped asking about the project, who had started assigning him to shopping malls and office towers and things that paid the bills but fed nothing in his soul. He told God about the nights. The 3 a.m. nights when he'd sat at his drafting table, he still used a drafting table, couldn't let go of the feel of pencil on paper and redrawn the same archways, the same window placements, the same impossible curves, trying to find the version of the design that someone would finally say yes to. The nights when his wife had come downstairs in her bathrobe, her hair messy, her eyes full of that terrible pity, and had stood in the doorway without saying anything because there was nothing left to say. Why won't you take this away from me? The question came out louder than he'd intended. It bounced off the stone walls and came back to him, smaller. If this isn't what you want me to do, if this dream isn't from you, then why can't I let it go? Why does it still hurt? Why does it feel like I'm dying every time I think about giving up? He opened his eyes. The crucifix hadn't moved. The stained glass hadn't shattered. The world had not rearranged itself around his pain. He was still a 42-year-old man sitting in a back pew, and God was still silent, and nothing had changed. Except his hand had drifted to his jacket pocket without his awareness. His fingers had closed around something, a piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent, the paper soft as cloth. He pulled it out and looked at it. The handwriting was his wife's. Lon had always had better handwriting than him, neat, precise, the letters formed with the kind of care that came from years of teaching elementary school. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed, and Min realized with a jolt that he must have been carrying this in his jacket for 3 years without knowing it. The investor didn't look like an investor. That was Min's first thought when he walked into the coffee shop on Saturday morning. The man sitting by the window was maybe 65, wearing a faded polo shirt and reading a physical newspaper, an actual newspaper, the kind Min hadn't seen anyone under 70 read in years. No laptop. No tablet. No air of someone about to dissect a business plan with surgical precision. Mr. Tran? Min approached the table, already recalibrating his expectations for the 3rd time since he'd parked his car. You're the architect. The man folded his newspaper and gestured to the chair across from him. Not a question. A statement. The one who's been trying to build a church. They talked for 40 minutes. Min walked through the project, the curved roof that was supposed to catch morning light, the breathing walls designed to make the sanctuary feel alive, the way the altar would sit at the precise angle where shadow and illumination met. The investor, his name was Mr. Hoa, and he'd made his money in textiles before retiring to chase interesting ideas, listened without interrupting. He didn't ask about ROI projections or market analysis or any of the questions Min had prepared answers for. Instead, when Min finally ran out of words, Mr. Hoa leaned back in his chair and said something that didn't make sense at first. 6 months ago, I would have passed on this. Min felt his stomach drop. Here it was. Another polite rejection dressed up in different language. But Mr. Hoa wasn't finished. 6 months ago, I was looking at a different kind of investment. Faster returns. Higher risk. The kind of thing that looks good on paper until you realize the paper was written by people who wanted you to see what they wanted you to see. Your project came across my desk back then. Someone forwarded your proposal. I deleted it. But then, Mr. Hoa continued, the other investments fell through. All of them. And I had time, 6 months of time, actually, to ask myself what I actually wanted my money to do before I died. Not what would grow fastest. Not what would impress my golf partners. What would still matter after I was gone. He pulled out a folder. Min recognized his own proposal inside, the one he'd sent to 17 different investors, the one he'd revised so many times he could recite the executive summary in his sleep. I've been researching your work for the last 3 months, Mr. Hoa said. Not just this project. Everything you've designed. The community center in District 7. The library renovation in Bintan. The way you think about space, you don't just build structures. You build places where people are supposed to feel something. Min didn't know what to say. No one had ever described his work that way. Most people talked about square footage and building codes and whether the budget could accommodate another elevator. I'm not going to fund your project the way you've been pitching it, Mr. Hoa said. The traditional investment model you've been chasing? It would have destroyed you. You would have been locked into timelines and interest payments and compromises that would have turned your church into just another building. He slid a different document across the table. But there's a community investment fund I've been working with. Slow money. Patient capital. They fund projects that aren't designed to make anyone rich, but are designed to last. Your project fits their criteria. It would have fit 6 months ago too, but I wouldn't have seen it then. I was too busy chasing the wrong things. Min stared at the document. The numbers were different from anything he'd seen before. Lower pressure. Longer timeline. Less money up front, but more sustainability over time. It wasn't the door he'd been knocking on for 3 years. It was a completely different door, in a completely different wall, and he hadn't even known it existed. The delay wasn't a rejection, Mr. Hoa said, as if reading Min's thoughts. It was protection. If you'd gotten funded 6 months ago, you would have taken the wrong deal from the wrong people, and your project would have collapsed within 2 years. I've seen it happen 100 times. Passionate people with beautiful ideas who sign contracts that kill the very thing they were trying to build. Min thought about the night in the church. The back pew. The piece of paper in his jacket pocket with his wife's handwriting, the one he'd apparently been carrying for 3 years without knowing it. You have a gift from God. Don't ever bury it. He'd spent 3 years trying to force open doors that were never meant to open. And the whole time, God had been keeping them closed. Not out of absence. Not out of indifference. Out of protection. The drive home took 45 minutes. Min didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. He just drove, letting the city blur past his windows, letting the weight of the last 3 years settle into a different shape inside his chest. When he walked through the front door, Lon was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen on Saturday afternoons, prepping meals for the week ahead with the same precision she'd used to grade elementary school. An hour later, Min walked through his front door, the scent of simmering broth and lemongrass greeting him before he even saw her. Lon stood at the kitchen counter, her back to him, the same posture she'd held through 23 years of marriage, through Saturday afternoons spent prepping meals with the quiet precision she'd once brought to her elementary school classroom. She didn't turn around when she heard his footsteps pause in the doorway. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice steady but worn, like a favorite sweater that had been mended too many times. Min studied her in the soft afternoon light, the gray threading through her hair at the temples, the slight stoop in her shoulders from years of carrying burdens he should have been sharing instead of hiding. This was the woman who had come downstairs at 3 in the morning, again and again, wrapped in her faded bathrobe, standing silent in the doorway of his study because all the words between them had long since been spent. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She turned around, and something in his face must have told her this wasn't about the meeting, because she set down the knife she'd been holding and gave him her full attention. "I need to say something." Min took a breath. Thank you. Lan's eyes widened, a flicker of uncertainty softening into something fragile and new. Her lips parted, but for a moment no sound came, only the quiet hope of someone afraid to believe what she'd just heard.